Got to say, I was a bit amazed that the language was so robust. Not just robust, harsh.
That's the reaction of the BBC's international editor Jeremy Bowen to a statement signed by the foreign ministers of the UK, France, Canada and others on Monday night, which seems to mark a clear shift in the international response towards Israel. We'll unpack what it means on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and first of all, we're going to talk about the situation in Gaza. Lots of things have been happening in the last few hours. We got a warning from the UN's top humanitarian, Tom Fletcher, former British diplomat, that 14,000 babies could die in the next 48 hours unless there is a major influx of aid into Gaza, because for several months the Israeli government has been restricting how much humanitarian assistance can go in to the area. Then, diplomatically, we had a big moment on Monday night when several foreign ministers, including David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary, signed a statement aimed at Israel, which was very critical of their handling of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Then just before we started recording this episode of Newscast on Tuesday afternoon at 4:30, we got a statement in the House of Commons from David Lammy where he repeated a lot of that rhetoric, but he also explained some practical steps that the UK is taking to change its diplomatic relationship with Israel. So there is a lot to talk about here, a lot to unpack, a lot of dots to join, because there's Trump-related stuff in this as well. So the person who's going to help us do all of that, as always, is the BBC's international editor, Jeremy Bowen, who is here. Hello, Jeremy.
Hi, nice to be back.
Thanks for coming in. We'll talk about the big geopolitical situation, which does feel like it's shifted quite a lot in the last 24 hours. But first of all, the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And it's so easy to say the humanitarian situation. What do we know about what's going on the ground?
Well, the humanitarian situation means that there are families there, the population is something just over 2 million, who have been living in the most appalling privation for a long time now, 19 months. I mean, bit by bit, most of Gaza has been turned into rubble. And the humanitarian situation means that they're not sure they'll get any food today. They're not sure they'll get clean water today. They're not sure if they need it, they'll get medical care today. In fact, they probably won't. And absolutely part of that is the fact they might get killed today. So that's what a humanitarian catastrophe, which is what is assailing Gaza, looks like.
But the Israeli government opened up kind of like a little door to some more humanitarian aid being delivered kind of right now, didn't they?
Well, Netanyahu said because to stay in power, he relies on the ultra-nationalist, extremist right wing who do not want to end the war and do not want one breadcrumb to be taken into Gaza. He said this is going to be minimal food. Now, yesterday, I think it was 5 trucks. I mean, that's nothing. That isn't even a drop in the bucket. And reportedly, it's not even clear that those trucks have got to where they need to be. They apparently had baby food in it. And there are more today. And the fact is, it's a population of 2 million. And so what they're doing is having said that the whole UN distribution system was hopelessly corrupted and intimidated by Hamas, who stole all the food and then sold it off at massive profits. The Israelis have now asked the UN to do this until their alternative mechanism that they're developing with the Americans is up and running, not before the end of this month. And why are they doing this? It's because they've been under pressure, particularly from the US. That's what really, I think, is the one they really listen to. And Trump himself has said there are some really hungry people there. They're starving. It's not a good idea. They're having a hard life. It shouldn't, I'm paraphrasing, it shouldn't be happening. And I think perhaps Israelis in Netanyahu and the people in his government who'd looked at Trump's first term, where basically he gave them everything they wanted and sometimes even more than they wanted, were not expecting to get some pushback from the Oval Office.
Well, we'll talk about the Americans in a second, but let's talk about the pushback coming from other places, including the UK, France, and Canada, whose foreign ministers signed a quite punchy statement about this situation, which was released on Monday night, and it's since been signed by lots of other foreign ministers. And then we saw David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, in the House of Commons on Tuesday afternoon, and here's some of what he said.
We are now entering a dark new phase in this conflict. Netanyahu's government is planning to drive Gazans from their homes into a corner of the Strip to the south and permit them a fraction of the aid that they need. Yesterday, Minister Smodrick even spoke of Israeli forces cleansing Gaza. Destroying what's left of residents, Palestinians, being relocated, he said, to third countries. We must call this what it is. It is extremism. It is dangerous. It is repellent. It is monstrous, and I condemn it in the strongest possible terms.
There's a lot to unpick there, so let's just go through it bit by bit. First of all, that reference to the Israeli finance minister Smotrich there, and this plan. What's the plan that David Lammy is referring to there?
Well, the Benjamin Netanyahu stays in power because he formed a coalition. It's always a coalition in Israel, which relied upon a couple of individuals and small, very ultra-nationalist parties. One of them is Bezalel Smotrich. The other one is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the national security minister. And he needs their votes to stay in power. They are as hardline as you can get, and they make absolutely no secret of what they want, which is for the Palestinians to get out or be pushed out, and for Jewish settlers to go there and take the place over. And they believe they're both religious, and they're both very nationalistic. They're both not at all afraid to talk about the use of force. And so there seems to be a plan to try to push the Palestinians to the south of Gaza. The UN says that it's already the case that about 70% of the territory of Gaza, and the territory of Gaza is really small, about the same size as the Isle of Wight, that 70% is effectively off limits to Palestinian civilians. For either they've been told to get out because of military action or because it's been declared part of buffer zones. There is a plan, it seems, to push them into an even smaller area, kettled down there, and there are hopes being raised from the hard right, like Mr. Smotrich, saying that they will get out and go to a third country. Netanyahu's also talked about that, and he also keeps saying, we support the Trump vision for Gaza, and their interpretation of the Trump vision for Gaza is not just a glittering Dubai-style range of glass skyscrapers, but a place where the Palestinians have been removed and put somewhere else. And Netanyahu has backed that too. So, I mean, that is, at the very least, ethnic cleansing, forced deportation. You cannot say if people are leaving now, they're leaving voluntarily, even if they sign any paper they can to get out, because the situation is so desperate. And people who believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, which is the elimination of a people in whole or in part or a group, will say that if you're trying to disperse them to the four winds, to different countries, if that is not elimination of them as a group, well, then what is? So these are really, really big issues and strong language and massively controversial. And it's very important to understand the size of what's happening.
So that's what these other governments are reacting to. What did you make of that statement that we got on Monday evening, signed by all those foreign ministers?
I've got to say, I was a bit amazed that the language was so robust. Not just robust, harsh. And the Prime Minister earlier on today, a couple of hours ago in the House of Commons, repeated that. If anything, put it a little bit more strongly, I felt. You've just heard David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, too. I mean, this is a sea change. Don't forget that, I mean, you know a million times more about British politics than I do. But it wasn't all that long ago that Labour was losing votes because the complaint was it was way too close to Israel and was ignoring bad things that Israel was doing in Gaza and indeed stopping their own people discussing them. And now we have a government that has gone completely the other way. So I've been trying to ask officials, what caused the sea change? And it seems to be, it's a combination of things. The 2-month ceasefire that Israel ended on March the 18th with a big series of surprise airstrikes, a massive amount of aid came in that period. So, in the words of one official, it showed that aid was a choice.
Because it was possible to do it.
Because it is possible to bring it in. And Israel claims, without actually providing a great deal of evidence, if any, that it all goes into the hands of Hamas. The UN says that is not the case, that they have tried and trusted methods of distributing it to the people who need it. There's also been a buildup of incidents. One of them, not the only one, was on that incident, you may remember, on the 25th of March when 15 paramedics and ambulance personnel were essentially ambushed and eliminated, killed by a squad of Israeli troops who claimed that they had posed a threat to them. But then when someone found in the mass grave where they buried the dead bodies a mobile phone and got into it, and one of these poor unfortunate guys had filmed what was happening before he was killed. You could hear him saying, the last prayers as I've watched the whole video. And that showed very clearly that these people were not being a threat. They contrary to what the Israelis said, their convoy was well lit, but the Israelis had told lies about it. And this, you can't keep doing that and retain credibility. So I think the combination of things, this, very harsh language that Israeli hardliners have used, that some people would say at least veers on the genocidal, certainly is open discussion of ethnic cleansing. The build-up of death, more destruction. The way that the Israelis are talking about launching, and they've partly started it, though not fully, a big new offensive in Gaza I think those countries have basically thrown up their hands and said, enough. This is not making Israel safer. We are your allies, but we cannot support you in what you're doing that. In fact, we cannot stay silent.
And then that brings us to what happened just before we started recording this conversation, which was David Lammy in the House of Commons saying, OK, the UK is meant to be having negotiations with Israel over a free trade agreement, a big theme of the last few weeks. Those negotiations are being paused as a result. And also the Israeli ambassador is being called into the Foreign Office, summoned as they talk about it in the jargon. What do you make of that as a kind of practical response from the British government?
Probably largely symbolic. I mean, trade with Israel, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's pretty important, I think, to both countries. The Israeli Foreign Ministry spokesman did a rather disparaging response on X. He posted something like, well, the negotiations are going really slowly anyway.
Or not even happening.
Yeah. Tzipi Hotovely, who's the ambassador over here, is a real Netanyahu loyalist. Very associated with the settler movement. And of course, part of that statement was not just about Gaza, it was about Israeli activities in the other side of the Palestinian territories, the West Bank, which they would like as a major part of a future state, and which Israel is grabbing more land, authorizing more settlements, expelling Palestinians from their homes, allowing armed Jewish settlers to raid villages. Sometimes it's alleged, and sometimes there's been proof of this as well, with the army looking on while they do it. Quite often, the army in the West Bank includes settlers who are in uniform. So I think that having interviewed her a couple of times, I say she should probably stand up for herself. But I think Britain is sending a strong message, as did France and Canada. Britain, by the way, I mean, what they're saying in the Foreign Office is that, this came from them, that they pushed this. It was part of it was a British diplomatic initiative to do this. So not only are they using the harsh language, they're claiming credit for it.
And then you mentioned the role of Trump. Okay, he was in the Middle East on this huge high-profile tour last week. He did not go to Israel. kind of the obvious thing to say is that that was a bit of a snub to Netanyahu, which shows a hardening of the American position. Is that a good assessment of that, a good interpretation of that?
I think the fundamentals of their relationship, which involve diplomatic support, political support, and particularly arms supplies, I think that's rock solid, military cooperation. However, Netanyahu is very good at putting up the backs of American presidents. The first one he dealt with was Bill Clinton back in 1996. He's Israel's longest serving prime minister. Bill Clinton grew to become, to put it politely, highly exasperated. He famously came out of his first meeting with Netanyahu when Netanyahu had lectured him about the Middle East and the world. And he says something like, who's meant to be the effing superpower here? I wasn't sure in that room. Judging by the way Netanyahu was behaving, he humiliated Barack Obama, or did his best to anyway, by going to the joint session of the US Congress, attacking his plan for a nuclear deal with Iran, which was Obama's, centerpiece of his foreign policy. He humiliated Biden on multiple occasions. He's been better with Republicans, and he got on very well with Trump in the first term. But now there's definite daylight between them. And I think that may be because, who knows with Trump really, but I think he is very, very focused on the rich oil monarchies of the Gulf. He clearly loved it down there, the bling, the power, this festering conflict that has gone on for more than a century. First of all, between Palestinian Arabs and Jews, and since 1948 between Israelis and the Palestinians as well. I mean, there are no easy wins there. There's only trouble there. So his attention, I think, has been focused on it. Plus, I think he probably is genuinely repelled by this what is clear now evidence of starvation caused by Israel's decision not to allow food in.
Jeremy, thank you.
Thanks very much. These are tough things to talk about, aren't they? I mean, what's happening over there is so hard. And one thing I have to add, from our point of view at the BBC and other international broadcasters, if we could get in there and report freely, then it would be easy, I think, to try and throw some light on what's happening. Israel, of course, does not let us in.
Now, the whole time I've been a political journalist at the BBC, there has been somebody there to advise, guide, and make me laugh. It is Jo Coburn, who was a political correspondent when I was like the tiniest little baby political journalist. And then she went on to be the co-presenter of Daily Politics with Andrew Neil, where I was a slightly larger political journalist as the reporter. Then I went off to Brussels and Jo Coburn started Politics Live, a whole new programme for BBC Two at lunchtimes. And a couple of weeks ago, Jo announced that she's moving on from Politics Live and she's moving on from the BBC onto pastures new. So we thought, because she's been on Newscast so many times and it's been so great to have her, we would catch up with her to get her thoughts in her last few days as a BBC political presenter. And I was joined by someone else who's been alongside me the whole time I've been here. It's Chris Mason. So here's the conversation me and Chris had with Jo as she counts down the minutes to handing in her BBC pass. Chris Mason is here. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
And we're joined by the legendary Jo Coburn from Politics Live. Hello, Jo.
Hello. I love that introduction, Adam. Legendary. Yes, I noticed one of the papers described me as that. I thought, goodness, I must leave more often.
Well, and also you are a legend because you're leaving, so you're going to be in the BBC history now.
Thank you for reminding me.
When is your last Politics Live, by the way?
On Thursday.
Ooh.
At the risk of sounding sort of insular, but newscasters will be able to relate to this from their own, whatever their life experience has thrown up. Really, when you've spent as long as you have within an institution.
Yes.
The
institution being the BBC.
Yeah. How contemplating departure? It must be quite a sort of big deal. I don't know the psychology of sort of thinking, oh crikey, I'm about to leave.
No, there's a lot of psychology, Chris. you are institutionalised after 28 years in a good and probably less good way. It really is your home, your family. It is about sort of slightly blinking into the sunlight after all that time. And that makes it daunting in so many ways. And the last few weeks have sort of galloped by after all this time. So I am feeling a little bit of trepidation, to be completely honest, but I still think it's the right decision. Thank goodness, since I can't change my mind now. So yes, Thursday will be the last programme and the last day. And of course, like every institution, this isn't unique to the BBC. Of course, life sort of stops. I hand back my pass. My name will probably be erased in that sense from the all the computer setup and network, and that will be that.
I had a colleague. I'll spare his blushes and won't name him. But a few years ago, he was leaving the BBC, and on his final day, he decided there was various bits and bobs that he was quite proud of that he'd done on the air that he wanted to kind of keep a recording of. So we were beavering away late at night, and I was on the late shift as a political correspondent, which finishes the wrong side of midnight. And he finished doing his bits and bobs at 10 past midnight and couldn't get out. Because
you have to bleep out of our office.
Yeah, his pass had expired at the end of his final day, and we were now in the day after.
Well, that's hilarious. That is the most visible and immediate sign that it's over, and you are expected to vacate the building. The one thing I will say, that's very funny. In fact, I think I know who that person is, and I will learn the lesson and make sure I'm out by 10 to midnight.
Depends when your party finishes.
That comes even later, and not in the BBC, thank goodness, in terms of having a hard stop. But one of the things that I've realised I won't have is I don't have lots of personal possessions at my desk that I need to clear out. I've noticed a pair of shoes that were discarded under the desk. I will obviously remove those, and a pile of books and various papers. But I don't feel like I've got a whole sort of bedroom full of stuff to take.
And Jo, we'll do some proper reminiscing in a second, but I want to get our money's worth first.
Charming.
So obviously yesterday's newscast was dominated by the UK-EU negotiations, and we did our big chat with Rachel Reeves. What have you picked up from the other political parties doing politics live yesterday and today?
About that deal?
Yeah.
Well, funnily enough, on today's programme, we did a sort of broad sweep of what the leaders were saying. And it is pretty well along Leave Remain lines, as you would expect. Kemi Badenoch and many of the Conservatives talking the language that we heard years ago of betrayal and surrender. We had Lee Anderson from Reform Party on today saying capitulation. It sort of brought me back to those Brexit years of which you were a key part, Adam Fleming, in Brussels with your big binder, I seem to remember. The Liberal Democrats, of course, thinking it's marvellous, and actually perhaps the government could have gone further when it came to the deal that was agreed by the Labour Party. And I think broadly the MPs that I've spoken to within Labour are pleased. Again, there'll be a little bit of a range of opinion in terms of some thinking perhaps we could have got even closer, and others with constituencies where they hope that things like the youth mobility scheme don't make people think of freedom of movement, and they've called it a youth, a youth experience scheme, which does make me feel it sounds like one of those gap years or, Eurostar, sort of a theme park, interrailing theme park for Europe. So I don't think there was anything unexpected, if you like, in that sense, from the immediate reactions from the different parties.
And Jo, just on another subject, the welfare system and specifically the winter fuel allowance, one of the interesting things that came out of our chat with Rachel Reeves yesterday was I thought Rachel Reeves of a few months ago, when asked, are you going to change your policy on who's eligible for winter fuel to maybe expand it so that more pensioners can get it, old Rachel Reeves would have said no. Rachel Reeves of yesterday said, I am listening. And she made it very clear she's open to the idea of a tweak if it's affordable. What have you been picking up from Labour backbenchers in particular about what they want and just how big a deal this is for them?
Oh, it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. If it wasn't a big deal before the local elections for some Labour MPs, it is now sort of urgent, if you like. One MP said the mood within the party ahead of the meeting that Keir Starmer had with the Parliamentary Labour Party and MPs was murderous and mutinous, is the way it was described to me, specifically on those cuts to pensioners on winter fuel payments. So I am not surprised that they are reconsidering, reviewing. We heard from the Labour leader in the Lords today, Angela Smith, say, well, I'm not commenting on any high-level discussions. So clearly there are high-level discussions going on. And she may even be part of those discussions. She wouldn't reveal on air, which was a shame. But it definitely is palpable. I think the strongest feeling we heard from Clive Lewis was expressed by him today when he said it really has brought it home. Our voters did not expect a Labour government to do this. It's not just about the policy. It speaks to values of the Labour Party that I adhere to and our supporters thought we held dear, and this flies in the face of it. And on the other side, what's been interesting is how difficult it is to cut welfare. In any shape, sense or form, whether you're a Conservative or a Labour politician. The Conservatives obviously say they wouldn't have cut that winter fuel payment. But it's not easy to do.
And Chris, we're recording this bit of this episode of Newscast on Tuesday lunchtime to fit in with Jo's Politics Live schedule.
Indeed.
I'm very grateful.
No waiting for Jo Coburn. But just as we're speaking, there is a bit of news breaking, courtesy of Henry Zeffman.
Yeah, so this garnishes, if you like, the conversation that you were having with the Chancellor on Newscast on Monday. Henry reporting that senior government figures are discussing whether to reverse the whole winter fuel payment decision, and then the question will be, how do you do it? Can you find another mechanism that means tests effectively who gets it and who doesn't? Obviously, the more people you effectively hand it back to, the less money that you save. You're going to take a political hit for doing the U-turn, but then as Jo says, Labour MPs have been falling over themselves to say that they've been absolutely hammered on this from pretty much day one of the government's time in office. And what was interesting, looking at the interview you did with Rachel Reeves and then comparing her words when she was also on LBC a couple of hours later, the words were pretty much the same. So
she's thought about this.
They clearly decided in advance, it's pretty obvious we're going to get asked about this stuff. What are we going to say? That is their current kind of holding line. The Prime Minister said something broadly in the same ballpark, talking privately to Labour MPs at Westminster last night. So yeah, the conversation is going on. It's tricky though, because if there'd been an obvious other way to do it last summer, they may have been tempted by that. Any other thing that made it less bad for some people, in other words, some people got to keep their winter fuel payment, would have clearly saved less money, and they were very keen to make what are known as in-year savings last summer, i.e. things that would make a difference to the bottom line of the government accounts straight away. So there's no easy solution to this, but they are clearly on manoeuvres to try and find one.
Right, let's open the JoCo files now. That's what Andrew Neil used to call you, wasn't it, JoCo?
Oh, it was. I made the mistake of admitting that had been my nickname. I don't know why I admitted it. It must have been one of those conversations after the programme. And then he continually called me JoCo.
JoCo.
So JoCo as a nickname predated Andrew Neil, did it?
Yes. Oh, yes, it was what I was called when I was a teenager by my friends, JoCo.
And do you like it as a nickname?
I do quite like it.
You do or you don't?
No, I do. I do.
Oh,
I
do?
don't mind it. I don't mind it at all.
Anyway, here's a big philosophical question,
Yes.
looking back on
Yes.
recent political history. So I was at a thing at the Institute for Government think tank on Tuesday morning where Nick Clegg, remember him?
I do.
Was doing a big speech.
Sir Nick Clegg.
Sir Nick Clegg, sorry, Nick. Looking back at the coalition government. And he said, that was such a different time. He was talking about how that's when Netflix was a company that sent you DVDs in the mail. And he said, we've got to get real. We're in 6-party politics now. And the next election is going to be like a roulette wheel. I just wonder, do you Do you think he's right that we are in a fundamentally new era, both in terms of technology, how people live, and how people express themselves politically, and what that means for the party system?
Right, how long have we got for this?
About 4 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I do broadly agree with him. Definitely.
The Brief Lectures by Jo Coburn.
Yeah, can you imagine?
Listen now,
Let me
BBC
begin.
Sounds.
Make
Sorry, Jo,
yourselves
keep going.
comfortable as I go on a lecture tour for the next hour and a half. I do think he's right about the fragmentation of politics. I think it's been extraordinary, the change since that huge majority that was won by Labour. And that victory for Labour after all those years of the Conservatives in power, obviously starting in 2010 in the coalition years, when actually on a day-to-day basis, when Nick Clegg was Deputy Prime Minister to David Cameron, it felt, funnily enough, even though we were in the midst or sort of coming out of the financial crash, there was a sort of calmness to the day-to-day decisions that they were making, as we always tried to sort of drive a wedge between the two of them in coalition. That, of course, was historic in itself because we hadn't seen coalition since the 1970s, but it wasn't then to be repeated. But I think one of the other big changes that he talked about, that you've mentioned, is about technology. And social media, for me, covering politics, first as a correspondent and then as a presenter, is that politicians now can communicate directly with the public via social media in a way that they couldn't. Yes, they came on to television programmes and radio programmes like ours. There weren't as many of them, of course. There's a proliferation now of the sort of mediums they can use. But this idea that you can go onto social media, communicate and respond directly with your constituents and the public, I think that has sort of completely changed the dial in terms of the way we cover politics too, and the way politicians behave and act. And one of the sort of visible examples of that was Jeremy Corbyn at Prime Minister's Questions talking, I felt, directly to people, using examples of members of the public. Then what he said would be put straight out onto social media and so on. It changed the dialogue, I think, within politics and how we covered it at Westminster.
And Jo, we're running out of time because Ukrainecast is coming to the studio to record their episode. But last thing I wanted to ask you, we've started doing this old newscast thing where we do episodes of newscast, but about from days and kind of recent political history. And we've done the financial crisis, the Good Friday Agreement, the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Oh.
When you come back as former BBC political correspondent and presenter Jo Coburn, which day from your career would you like to do?
That's a very good question.
We can leave it hanging and we can get back to you.
There are so many. Yes, which day would I like? I know. Which sounds terribly self-indulgent, and that's the day we launch Politics Live.
Oh,
yes,
steeped in our nation's history.
No, steeped
Written
in
into the
my
annals of
history.
time.
If I could just be self-indulgent for one moment. I remember we had Amber Rudd, Emily Thornberry, Laura Kunsberg, I think Anushka Astana from ITV, and Camilla Tominey on that first all-women panel on Politics Live in 2018.
You know, I remember it well. And also, I mean, I just know from experience, setting up a new thing and then it continuing is such a massive achievement in this media environment.
I have thought of one other programme that was...
It was a whole series.
It is a whole series. In fact, I can think of a few. Well, I've thought of many. But the two, one of them, perhaps a bit cruel to Kwasi Kwarteng, the former Chancellor, was when he was flying back from Washington to be sacked by Liz Truss. And we were live on air doing a special programme, sort of tracking the plane coming back as he went to see the Prime Minister at that time and lose his job. Of course, she was to lose hers or step down shortly afterwards. And that came after the programme of the budget that they did, that fateful budget, and Faisal Islam, our colleague, standing up and jumping up and down because he was holding his laptop saying, oh my goodness, the markets are reacting in real time here. Now, I'm not saying I'd like to repeat what happened, but those programmes will stay in my mind forever.
I think he found out, didn't he, Kwasi Kwarteng, via a tweet from Steve Swinford, the political editor at the time, whilst he was going around a roundabout in Chiswick. Something like that. Anyway, he just got off the plane.
That's
Jo
great
also knows
detail.
very well.
Great detail. Yes.
Jo, thank you so much. Thanks for being such a good colleague. And I know we're saying goodbye to you as colleagues, but we'll still be friends, well, forever. So it's adieu for now.
Oh, well, lots of love.